My name is Corbin Vance. It is a name I feel I must commit to record. Perhaps as a testament that a man named Corbin Vance once existed, with thoughts and fears, all his own, before this place. I write this by the dim, flickering light of a battery-powered lantern. A contraband item, I suppose, though it's not explicitly forbidden by them. Not yet, anyway. The official rules, the ones typed on that grimly photocopied sheet, are specific enough. It's the unwritten ones. The ones you learn by the cold dread that seeps into your bones, that are the true torment. 3 months ago, my life was a different kind of ruin. A cascade of unfortunate investments. A business partner who vanished with more than just profits. Why? And the looming shadow of debts I could no longer service had left me, teetering on the precipice of utter destitution. The polite eviction notice felt like a death knell. My resume, once respectable, now seemed to repel potential employers. We soon discovered why. It was in this fog of desperation that I stumbled upon the online advertisement. Operations technician required, Dakota Plains Petroleum storage. Remote location, excellent compensation. Accommodation provided. The salary quoted was almost offensively generous, the kind that screamed of a catch. But I was in no position to be discerning. North Dakota, a place I'd only known as a vast, cold square on a map, suddenly represented a lifeline. The name itself, Corbin, derived from the old word for raven, sometimes felt like a minor personal omen, a dark bird perpetually circling my misfortunes. Now it seemed that raven was flying me towards an unknown, and perhaps equally dark fate. The journey itself was a descent into an ever-widening emptiness. After the flight to Bismarck, it was a series of increasingly dilapidated buses, then a prearranged, silent taxi ride that stretched for hours. The landscape of North Dakota unrolled like a faded, monotonous tapestry, immense, featureless plains under a sky that seemed too large, too indifferent. Towns became hamlets, then mere suggestions of habitation, until finally, there was nothing but the wind sighing through dry grasses and the endless, ruler, straight road. The driver, a man whose face I never clearly saw in the perpetual twilight of our journey, deposited me in my single duffel bag at a desolate crossroads. He pointed a gloved hand towards a barely visible track disappearing into the gloom. "Depots that way. They'll pick you up." Then he was gone, his taillights shrinking into the vast darkness like dying embers. The air was cold, carrying the faint, metallic tang of distant industry and something else, something ancient and earthy, like disturbed soil. I waited for what felt like an eternity. Why? The silence, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the prairie grass, and the oppressive weight of the isolation pressing in on me. Eventually, the low rumble of an engine grew, and a battered pickup truck, its headlights cutting weak swathes through the dark, emerged. The man at the wheel didn't speak, merely fronted and gestured for me to get in. As we approached Dakota Plains Petroleum storage. Why? Its silhouette rose against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky like a mechanical beast, a collection of stark, utilitarian towers and skeletal pipework. Harsh, sodium vapor lights cast an unnatural orange glow over the compound. making the shadows between the towering storage tanks seem deeper, more absolute. There was a constant, low hum that vibrated through the very ground, a sound that felt less like machinery and more like the breathing of some colossal, slumbering entity. The overwhelming scent hit me, then a cloying mix of crude oil, chemical solvents, and the cold, damp smell of aging metal. It was the smell of industry, yes, but amplified, concentrated. Why? As if the very air was saturated with the deepwood's essence. Even from the truck, I felt a prickling sensation on my skin. Why? The distinct and unsettling feeling of being observed, though the yard seemed deserted save for our vehicle. This place felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. The engineered precision of the layout, the endless rows of pipes and tanks, seemed to actively suppress any hint of the natural world, creating an environment that was both man-made and profoundly alien. My orientation was brief, conducted by a man named Hemlock. His name, I later thought, was another of those subtle, cruel ironies. He was a tall, gaunt figure with eyes like chips of ice and a voice as dry as the prairie dust. He offered no welcome, no pleasantries, just a curt nod and a gesture towards a small, windowless office. On the scarred metal desk lay a single sheet of paper, a list. "Your predecessor didn't pay these enough mind," Hemlock stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "These aren't suggestions, Vance. They're for your continued employment and well-being." I picked up the sheet. The rules were typed, stark and numbered 1. All personnel must be inside designated break areas or control rooms between 0200 and 2:15 a.m. No exceptions. Do not investigate any sounds heard from the yard during this 15-minute window. 2. If you observe unusual luminescence or a shimmering effect around Tank 07, avert your gaze immediately and report it via the internal comm system using code Sigma. Do not approach Tank 07 under these circumstances. 3. Personnel are forbidden from bringing mirrors of any kind onto the premises. Any personal reflective surfaces larger than a watch face must be declared and stored in lockers. I looked up, a question forming on my lips, but Hemlock's expression was a granite wall. "Shift starts at 1800. Your bunk is in Block C. Number 4. Don't be late." He turned away, dismissing me. The rules themselves were the first true seeds of a specific, gnawing fear. A foreshadowing of threats I couldn't yet comprehend. Discovered why. The 2 a.m. curfew hinted at something that roamed the depot under the cover of deepest night. The warning about Tank 07 suggested some kind of visual phenomenon, dangerous to behold. And the prohibition on mirrors. That was the most unsettling, hinting at something that might perceive us, or be perceived by us, through reflections. Something that could perhaps even cross over. The lack of explanation, Hemlock's utter detachment, only amplified the sense that I had stumbled into a place governed by an alien and hostile logic. My first shift was a blur of unfamiliar tasks, the cold biting at my exposed skin. Why? The omnipresent hum of the depot a constant companion. I tried to dismiss the rules as some bizarre form of hazing, an overzealous adherence to arcane safety protocols born of isolation. Surely, this was just a job, a hard, remote job, but a job nonetheless. Then around 2:05 a.m., I was in the small, grimy break room in Sector Beta, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. From the yard outside, beyond the thick, reinforced door, I heard a faint, rhythmic scraping. It wasn't metallic, not exactly. It sounded wet, heavy, like something substantial being dragged across the frozen earth. My heart hammered. Rule 1. Do not investigate any sounds. I stayed put, my gaze fixed on the door, every nerve ending screaming. The sound faded after a few minutes, leaving an even more profound silence in its wake. Later, as I was making my rounds near the perimeter fence, my flashlight beam swept across the towering bulk of Tank 0.7. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw it, a faint, oily shimmer clinging to its vast, curved surface, like heat haze on a summer road, but this was the frigid heart of a North Dakota night. It pulsed, almost imperceptibly, then vanished. My breath caught. Was it a trick of the harsh security lights reflecting off condensation? Fatigue. I told myself it was. I didn't report it. I didn't want to seem like a fool, spooked by shadows on my very first night. But the ambiguity of it, the chilling possibility that the rules were not just words on paper, began to settle deep within me. A cold stone in the pit of my stomach. The depot was already working its insidious magic, making me question my own senses, my own sanity. The initial shock of the depot and its strange edicts slowly gave way to the grim reality of routine. Why? Days and nights blurred into a monotonous cycle of inspections, gauge readings, and the endless thrum of machinery that seemed to beat in time with my own increasingly frayed nerves. Each task, we soon discovered why. No matter how mundane, checking pressures on a pipeline, logging fuel levels. Why? Even the mandatory sweep for spills became tinged with an undercurrent of dread. Were these safety protocols truly for preventing industrial accidents? Or were they part of a more elaborate, unspoken ritual to keep something else at bay? Something contained within the labyrinth of steel and concrete. The isolation, as predicted by any study of remote work, began to take its toll. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by the groan of settling pipes or the distant, mournful cry of the prairie wind. Sounds that my imagination, fueled by the rules, twisted into something more sinister. I found myself becoming jumpy, starting at the sudden hiss of a valve or the clang of a dropped tool. The other workers were specters. Why? Faces glimpsed in the harsh glare of the yard lights, or across the desolate canteen, their eyes holding a shared, haunted quality. Why? There was no camaraderie, no idle chatter, just the oppressive weight of unspoken anxieties. We were islands of fear in a sea of industrial desolation. It was during my second week, while searching for a missing manifest in a rarely used supply closet, that I found more rules. Tucked beneath a stack of outdated safety manuals, yellowed and stained, was another photocopied sheet, cruder than the first, as if typed on an older machine. 4. If you encounter wildlife behaving erratically within the depot perimeter. TG. Birds flying repeatedly into structures. Deer standing motionless and staring directly at you for prolonged periods. Do not approach. Report to security via Channel 3 and vacate the immediate area until cleared. 5. Under no circumstances should personal food items be left unattended outside of designated, refrigerated units, even for brief periods. Discard any food item that has been left out. Do not consume it, regardless of appearance. 6. If you hear faint music or whispering seemingly originating from the older pipelines in Sector Gamma, particularly near Junction 12, increase ambient operational noise if possible, e.g. activate nearby pumps if scheduled. Utilize approved wide-spectrum radio static. Do not attempt to discern words or melodies. Report code Indigo. The rule about wildlife sent a particular chill down my spine. North Dakota's prairies were teeming with life. But the idea of animals behaving unnaturally, as if corrupted or compelled by some unseen force, was deeply unsettling. It hinted that the influence of this extend beyond the human into the very fabric of the natural world it had usurped. The food rule preyed on a primal fear of contamination, of unseen poisons. And the whispering pipeliness that spoke of a more insidious threat? Something that could bypass physical defenses and creep directly into the mind. The true, undeniable horror, however, arrived with a man named Henderson. He was young, barely out of his teens. Why? With a brash confidence that grated in the oppressive atmosphere of the depot. He'd clearly been hired to fill a recent, unexplained vacancy. During his perfunctory briefing with Hemlock, I saw it. From a distance, Henderson had scoffed openly when shown the list of rules, particularly Rule 3 regarding mirrors. "What, afraid we'll see how miserable we look?" he'd quipped, loud enough for me to overhear. Hemlock hadn't reacted, his face impassive. That evening, Henderson, in a show of defiance, propped a small, cheap shaving mirror on the shelf above his bunk in Block C. I shared the block with him and a quiet, perpetually nervous older worker named Elias. I felt a prickle of unease, a premonition, but I said nothing. Who was I to enforce these bizarre regulations? Around 03:00 a.m., well past the 2 a.m. curfew, discover a sound ripped through the walls of our quarters, a single, choked scream, abruptly cut off. Elias and I were out of our bunks in an instant. We hammered on Henderson's door. Silence. Elias, his face chalky in the dim corridor light, fumbled with a master key he clearly wasn't supposed to have. The room was cold, unnaturally so. Henderson was on his bunk, rigid, his eyes wide and staring at the ceiling, utterly vacant. His mouth was agape, frozen in that silent scream. The floor, beneath the shelf, lay the shattered remains of his shaving mirror, the fragments scattered like broken teeth. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. Just Henderson, his mind seemingly wiped clean, and the broken mirror. This was the discovery. The rules weren't just bizarre. They were lethally serious. The threat wasn't imagined, it was real, and it was here. Within minutes. 2 figures in unmarked coveralls, company medical personnel. Though they had the grim efficiency of undertakers, arrived. We soon discovered why. They bundled Henderson onto a stretcher with a chilling lack of urgency, their faces obscured by shadows and the collars of their coats. No questions were asked, no explanations offered. He was simply removed. The event was swallowed by the depot's silence, another secret absorbed into its metallic heart. My paranoia ratcheted to an unbearable level. I became a zealot of the rules, my waking hours consumed by a meticulous adherence to every bizarre stipulation. I tried to rationalize Henderson's fate, a sudden, catastrophic stroke, perhaps, or an undiagnosed psychiatric condition triggered by the stress and isolation. But the shattered mirror, the timing, the chilling emptiness in his eyes, it all pointed back to Rule 3. I started watching the other workers more closely. Their faces were masks of carefully controlled fear. They exchanged furtive, knowing glances, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which we all lived. But no one ever spoke of Henderson, or of the rules, or of the things that undoubtedly happened in the deep, dark hours of the North Dakota night. This shared, unspoken terror was a heavier burden than any physical labor. One blustery afternoon, why, while recalibrating flow meters near the western perimeter fence, I overheard two gruff, we soon discovered why, older maintenance workers, men who looked as though they'd been hewed from the prairie rock itself, speaking in low tones. Their words were snatched by the wind, but I caught fragments used. The old stories land don't like being cut so deep. And something about things the earth coughs up when it's angry. It was a fleeting reference. Perhaps just the ramblings of superstitious old men. But it resonated with a disturbing clarity. Just beyond the fence line, half hidden in the coarse grass, I saw a peculiar arrangement of rusted metal shards and bleached animal bones, almost like a crude, forgotten offering. The next day, it was gone, cleared away by some unseen hand. The depot, it seemed, was not just an industrial complex. It was a wound on the land, and perhaps the land, or something tied to it, was beginning to fester. We discovered why. Henderson's vacant stare and the shattered mirror became a permanent fixture in my mind. A terrifying confirmation that the rules were not arbitrary, but a fragile shield against an active, malevolent presence. My fear, once a dull H, sharpened into a desperate need for answers. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding the nature of the prison I inhabited. I began, cautiously at first. Why? To deviate from my prescribed routines. My eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. Why? Any clue that might illuminate the darkness that enveloped Dakota Plains petroleum storage. Discovered why. This search for forbidden knowledge felt like a transgression in itself, a step onto even more treacherous ground. I started a journal, this very document, scrawling entries by the weak beam of my hidden lantern. A habit born of the need to record, to solidify the increasingly surreal experiences before my own mind began to fray. We soon discovered why. It was a small act of defiance, a way to assert my own reality against the crushing weight of the depot's secrets. My search led me to the older, less used sections of the facility. In a long abandoned locker room in Sector Delta, a place that reeked of rust and forgotten despair, I found it. Tucked behind a corroded panel, I discovered a small, water-stained notebook. Its pages were filled with a spidery, frantic script. It was a diary, or fragments of one, left by someone named Arthur. His entries spoke of the watchers in the pipes, the geometry of the fear, and the patterns in the frost that spell out warnings. There were crude, unsettling drawings, stick figures contorted in impossible angles, a recurring symbol like a fractured eye, and sketches of shadowy forms with too many limes. One chilling entry read, Rule 7 came today. Tacked to my door, it sees me. It knows what I'm thinking. The old rules were a lie. They change. They always change. Arthur's entries ended abruptly. Mid-sentence. The discovery of his tormented words sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I was not the first to walk this path of dawning horror. The depot had a history, a lineage of victims. The only person I felt I could even remotely approach was Elias, the quiet, older worker who had been with me when we found Henderson. He was a man perpetually hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden, his eyes darting nervously. For days he rebuffed my attempts at conversation, shaking his head, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. But one night, after a particularly unsettling incident, a section of pipeline in Sector Gamma had begun to vibrate violently, emitting a guttural moan that wasn't mechanical, a sound that made our teeth ache. Elias finally broke. Why? We were huddled in the relative safety of a control booth, the moaning still a faint tremor in the floor. It's the ground, he whispered, his voice raspy, barely audible. This place if it's built on wrong ground. The drilling it went too deep. Woke something that should have slept. He spoke of shadows that walk the perimeter when the moon is new, and the true price of the oil here, paid in more than just dollars. He claimed some of the rules were ancient, passed down verbally long before Hemlock or the typed lists. Others, he said, were newer, as if the think was learning, adapting. Sometimes, he said, his wide with a terror that seemed to have taken permanent root. New rules just appear, on the boards, or whispered on the wind, and sometimes they contradict the old ones. His words confirmed Arthur's frantic scribblings. The rules were not static, they were evolving. A shifting labyrinth designed by a malevolent intelligence. The illusion that adherence could guarantee safety was a cruel joke. Just last week, I'd noticed a subtle alteration to Rule 2 regarding Tank 07. The original, unusual luminescence or a shimmering effect, had been amended on the main notice board. A small, neatly typed addendum now specified. Report code Omega for any pulsating, deep crimson luminescence. Maintain extreme visual discipline. Immediate area lockdown protocol may be initiated without further warning. Code Sigma was gone. Code Omega was new. The shimmering was now crimson and pulsating. The entity was indeed changing the terms of engagement. This realization was compounded by a growing conflict in the rules themselves. An old, standing order, Rule 9, clearly stated, under no circumstances is personnel to run while on external walkways or in the yard. Maintain a deliberate, steady pace at all times. Yet, a new directive, posted only days ago, and specific to operations in Sector Delta, reading, in the event of seismic tremors or unexplained ground subsidence in Sector Delta, evacuate to designated muster points immediately. Expediency is paramount. How could one evacuate with expediency without running? It was a paradox, a deliberate trap. The horror, which had once felt like an ambient threat, began to feel intensely personal. One morning, I found my work gloves, which I always left on my small bedside table, placed neatly in the center of my bunk, filled with dead, desiccated moths. Another time, a page torn from Arthur's diary, one I was certain I had secured in my hidden journal, appeared pinned to my locker. A single, fresh drop of what looked like crude oil marring its surface. Then came the note, slipped under my door while I was on shift. It wasn't typed. It was written in a shaky, spidery hand, eerily similar to Arthur's, yet subtly different. It contained a single, new rule, unnumbered, addressed directly to me. Corbin Vance. The raven seeks too much. Some doors are not to be opened. Some reflections show more than the gazer. Stop looking, or you will become part of the pattern. Knew my name. It knew my symbolic namesake. It knew I was searching. The cold dread that had been my constant companion now felt like a physical presence. Its icy breath on the back of my neck. I was no longer just an employee at a strange depot. I was a subject of interest to the unseen. A mouse in a maze whose walls were constantly shifting. The personalized note, the chilling reference to the raven, shattered any remaining vestiges of denial. I was marked. The entity, whatever it was, an ancient spirit of the disturbed land. A consequence of some forgotten industrial sin. Or, something far stranger, was aware of my probing, my desperate attempts to understand. The confrontation, stage of this horrifying play, was no longer a distant possibility. It was an inevitability, hurtling towards me like an unlit freight train in the prairie night. My search for answers had, perhaps, led me too close to a truth the depot was designed to obscure. Elias, in one of his rare, fear-choked whispers, had once mentioned the old core, a section of the facility supposedly decommissioned decades ago, rumored to be the epicenter of the original event that necessitated the rules. He spoke of it almost like one might speak of a cursed tomb, a place where the veil between realities was thinnest. He'd also hinted that the Stanley R. Mickelson Safeguard Complex, that Cold War relic not too far from some of these oil regions, had its own dark legends, whispers of experiments gone awry, of energies unleashed and never fully contained. Could this depot be unknowingly built upon, or near such a scar? Its petroleum storage a mundane mask for a deeper, more terrifying containment. The rules, then, were not just for employee safety, but remnants of a failed protocol. A desperate attempt to manage an unmanageable horror. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating, creeping dread. It was a night shift, the air thick with impending snow, the wind howling a mournful dirge through the skeletal pipework. I was assigned to Sector Gamma, near the older pipelines, the ones Elias had warned about, the ones that whispered. Rule 6. Increase ambient operational noise. Do not attempt to discern words or melodies. Tonight, however, the usual hum of the pumps was strangely muted, almost swallowed by the wind. And the whispers, they were louder than I'd ever heard them, insidious and sibilant, seeming to coil around me from the cold steel of Junction 12. They weren't in English, not quite, but the cadence, the suggestive tones promised knowledge, understanding, the very things I craved. Then the lights in Sector Gamma flickered, died, and plunged me into absolute darkness, save for the weak beam of my company-issued flashlight. My radio crackled with static, then fell silent. I was alone, isolated, with the whispers growing more insistent, more seductive. And then, Tank 07, visible even from this distance, across the yard, beglow. Not the faint shimmer I'd dismissed on my first night. This was a deep, pulsating crimson, a sickening, arterial light that painted the undersides of the low, hanging clouds in hellish hues. I squeezed my eyes shut, remembering the amended rule, the warning of extreme visual discipline. But the whispers intensified, now seemingly coming from all around me, urging me to look, to see. The pattern, Corbin. See the pattern. The raven must see. My resolve crumbled. I had to know. I opened my eyes and looked towards Tank 07. What I saw was not a simple luminescence. The crimson light was a tear, a wound in the fabric of the night, and within it, or behind it, was something. It was a vortex of impossible geometry, shifting, coalescing, a thing of angles that hurt the eyes and lines that defied perspective. It was vast, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly alien. It felt like staring into the exposed heart of a dying god, or the cold, calculating mind of the abyss itself. And in its depths, I saw reflections not of the deepwood, but of other places, other times, other screaming faces. Arthur's fractured eye symbol was there, pulsing in time with the crimson light. Panic, raw and primal, seized me. Rule 9. Do not run. Rule for Sector Delta: evacuate with expediency. Which rule to follow when the rules themselves were a trap? Designed by this thing. I ran, blindly, stumbling over pipes and frozen earth. Why? The whispers now shrieks of what sounded like mocking laughter. I ran towards the main gate, towards the illusion of escape. As I neared the perimeter, I saw him, Hemlock, standing by the gatehouse, his face illuminated by the crimson glow from Tank 07. He wasn't looking at the tank. He was looking at me. And he was smiling. A slow, terrible smile that held no mirth, only a chilling, ancient understanding. He didn't try to stop me. He simply watched as I fumbled with the gate controls, my hands slick with sweat despite the freezing air. The gate groaned open. I don't know how I made it to the access road. I don't know how long I ran across the frozen prairie. Eventually, headlights found me, a bewildered trucker on a pre-dawn run. I tried to tell my story. The company, Dakota Plains Petroleum Storage, denied everything. I was a disgruntled employee, they said, suffering from stress-induced psychosis due to the isolation. There was no Henderson on their recent employment records. Elias, they claimed, had taken early retirement due to ill health weeks before my alleged breakdown. Arthur's notebook, my journal, confabulations, they said, proof of my instability. I am out now. I am ostensibly free. But the prairie night is never truly dark enough to hide the memory of that crimson glow. The wind, on certain nights, still carries those whispers. I see that fractured eye symbol and condensation on windows, in the patterns of cracks in the pavement. The rules, some of them, still echo in my mind, a permanent litany of dread. I write this as a warning, though I fear it is a futile one. Dakota Plains Petroleum storage still operates. It still hires. The oil still flows. And the thing beneath it, or within it, or intrinsically part of it, still waits. It still watches. Perhaps it's even spreading. Its influence seeping out with every barrel of oil drawn from that violated land. Sometimes I wake in the night, convinced I am back in Block C, the air cold, the whispers coiling. I check my reflection in the darkened window, half expecting to see not my own face, but something else, something with too many angles. Staring back from a place that is not North Dakota, but somewhere far older and far more terrible. The raven saw, and now the raven can never truly look away. The pattern, I fear, is not yet complete.